Hey guys, this is Alex with East Coast Divers, and today I'm actually going to take a second and I'm going to talk about the difference between yoke connectors and DIN connectors. Now, as always, I get a lot of questions from newer divers, people that might not be 100% aware of what really the difference is between a DIN and a yoke and how that's going to affect them for the way that they dive locally, the way that they dive when they travel, and if they can do things like change a yoke valve to a DIN valve and how that might work, which you can, but there's a few different ways that you can do it depending on what makes the most sense for you. Now, first and foremost, talking about the difference, the DIN connector on a valve originally stemmed from Europe, specifically Germany, and it's become more and more popular throughout the world, including in the States. Now, some of the places that you see this a little bit more commonly is for anybody who does any sort of technical diving, rebreather diving, they're going to use, for the most part, DIN valves almost exclusively, compared to a yoke valve, which is what a lot of newer divers are familiar with and used to seeing, which is something that a lot of sport divers use who have kind of just taken it up from the way that they learned. So it's become really popular because newer divers, when they travel, they're typically going to use something like this, and any place that deals with traveling divers, which is basically any place, is going to have the ability to cater to this. So it's really hard to get this out of the system if we were to want to, because it's hard to just stop that. Now, the way that it works is when you have a yoke valve that attaches to a yoke tank, it's got a little O-ring, and in fact, here's an insert for a yoke. And you can see that there's an O-ring right inside here, and what happens is when those two pieces come together, it creates a little gap, and that O-ring sits inside that gap. Then when the air goes in, it tries to flow out between those two pieces of metal where the O-ring is, and it kind of inflates that O-ring to fill up all those little gaps so that the air doesn't leak out. Now, because of that, it puts a lot of stress and strain on that O-ring because it's constantly kind of moving around and getting inflated and deflated. So you'll see that it gets a lot of wear and tear. It's constantly going to be getting little nicks and cuts and pieces of rubber that are trying to peel away. And over time, that's going to create little leaks that'll eventually become bigger and bigger leaks. And that becomes really common with a yoke tank, is that it's going to have little whispers of air that are coming out of it almost constantly. If you do a dive with 6 or 7 other divers on the boat, you're guaranteed to see at least a few that do have that little whisper of air coming out between the valve, the tank valve, and your regulator. All right. Compared to with a DIN and the way the DIN attaches, we saw that on the yoke it has the O-ring captured inside the valve. Well, on a DIN, the O-ring's actually captured inside of the DIN connector on the regulator, so that when you screw this in to the big hole on the valve, the DIN valve, that it's going to take that O-ring and it's actually going to press it against the back of that DIN valve. So instead of having something that is, going to inflate and deflate every time you pressurize it, what it's actually doing is it's using what we call a captured O-ring. It's pressing that O-ring, capturing that O-ring in the back, and it's putting a little bit less wear and tear on it. It's just there to make sure that that spill out air doesn't actually happen. And it's going to, 1, typically last a little bit longer, assuming it doesn't pop out and you lose it, but 2, it's going to be a little bit more consistent for the way that it seals. And obviously that's really important as you go down deeper and every breath is taking more gas out of the tank. You want to make sure you're not losing any gas at all, which is how these became really popular for tech divers. So we know kind of how they work and what they do and their advantages, but the question is, how can we potentially switch back and forth and what should you use? Well, first and foremost, we typically recommend people use DIN if they have the ability to own their own cylinders, maybe if they don't travel quite so much and they don't want to deal with swapping back and forth all the time. If that isn't an option, there are some other things that you can do. On a DIN connector like this, they make a screw-on piece that you can screw onto the DIN, turn it into a yoke. Now, that may work for you, but one of the problems that you're going to run into, as opposed to that regulator only coming maybe a few inches out from the valve when it attaches, that connector is going to make it come almost twice as far out now, so it's more likely to hit you in the back of the head. So for some divers, that's not an option. The other thing you can actually do is you can unscrew this assembly, this DIN assembly, and you can unscrew this yoke assembly, and you can replace it with a compatible yoke that's designed for that regulator, or compatible DIN that's designed for the regulator. That can be a little taxing for some people that might not be the best with a set of tools, or people that don't want to think about it, potentially could lose those parts in between, different dive trips. So that could run into some issues for you as well. Now, if you're never doing any particularly deep diving, you just want to make sure that you're going to be able to find tanks that are going to work on your trip, you're really safest just going with a yoke valve. Then you know you're going to have something that's going to connect with most of the different dive resorts that are out there. You can take it almost anywhere it's going to work. All right. Now, on the valves themselves, you can actually have a valve that can do double duty, but it kind of depends on the tank that it's attaching to. So this is a 3,000 PSI tank. You could put a DIN or a yoke onto there. Anything up to about a 3,400 PSI tank, really the 3,442 you can get on there, because something magical happens when you hit 3,500 PSI, at least in the States. So one of the things you can do with this DIN regulator is they make these inserts that you can screw into, or I should say this DIN tank and valve. You can screw that insert into there and you can turn a DIN valve into a yoke valve. And now you can attach a yoke to it. And then if you had a DIN that you needed to attach to it next, obviously you can just pop that out and it turns it back into a DIN. You'll notice that there are some valves that have a little bit of a, kind of like an angle to them, or might be a little bit deeper. It's what they call a 300 bar valve, and it's really designed to work with high pressure gas. So at 3,500 PSI, it's basically looked at that the pressure is so high that you would have to use a DIN regulator with it. So they don't make it so there's an insert that you can put in there. They basically go through a lot of effort to make sure that you can't attach a yoke to it because they think that it's too much pressure for the yoke to be able to handle. In the event of that, you would essentially have to use a DIN valve. All right. So those are some of the differences. Very, very, very quick and just basic overview of what the difference between a DIN valve and a yoke valve really is and where they would apply. Obviously, there is a wealth more of information. I just touched on things very, very, very quickly just to give you guys a brief overview of how that stuff works. If you want to know more about it, there's tons of stuff on the internet to be able to read, but also I'm more than happy to answer any emails that you guys throw my way. I'm happy to point you in the direction of what you may or may not need and some things that you can use to make diving a little bit easier for you. So feel free to shoot me an email at alex@ecdivers.com. That's the letter E, the letter C, the word divers.com. You can also just give us a call at the shop at 617-277-2216. We're located in Boston, Massachusetts. And hopefully you'll take an opportunity to go through, check out some of our other Gear Fix-It videos to make sure that you guys never miss a dive. All right, thanks for coming, checking us out, and hopefully we'll see you soon.